New construction options. Building. Construction complete. Cannot deploy here. New construction options. Construction complete. New construction options. Building. Unit ready.
Reporting.
Training.
Roger.
Unit ready. Training.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Got it.
Training.
Reporting.
Unit ready.
Right away, sir.
Training. Unit
Reporting.
ready.
You got it.
Training. Unit
Waiting
ready.
order. Affirmative. You got it.
Training.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Roger.
Unit ready.
Awaiting orders. Right away, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Roger. Awaiting Roger.
Construction complete. New construction options. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. You got it. Reporting.
Unit boss.
Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit boss.
Yes, Roger. You got it.
Unit boss.
Awaiting affirmative. Ready and waiting.
Construction complete. New construction options. Building. On hold. Cancelled. Unit boss. Unit boss.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Yes, acknowledge.
Building. Unit ready. Building. Construction complete. Low power. Building. Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Building. On hold. Cancelled.
Yes, sir. Awaiting orders.
Building.
Awaiting orders.
Ready.
Yes, sir.
Insufficient
Affirmative.
funds.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Construction complete. New
Acknowledge.
construction
Affirmative.
options. Building.
Affirmative. Yes, acknowledge.
Building. On hold. Cancelled. Unit ready.
Acknowledge.
Building.
Acknowledge. 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 Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Waiting. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Building.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Cannot deploy here. New construction options. Building.
Yes, acknowledge. Yes, sir.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready. Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Building. Construction complete. Building.
Report. Affirmative. Affirmative. Knowledge. Knowledge.
Construction complete. Building. Insufficient
Vehicle
funds.
report. Yes. Knowledge. Knowledge. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Reporting. Knowledge. 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 Affirmative. Waiting on. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Vehicle acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes, sir.
Unit ready. Construction
Yes.
complete.
Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Building. Building.
Report. Affirmative.
On hold. Cancel. Building.
Affirmative.
Construction complete. Building.
Waiting. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Awaiting order. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Yes, affirmative. Yes, sir. Awaiting order. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Structure sold.
Vehicle acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Construction complete. Building. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Insufficient funds.
Waiting for knowledge. Affirmative. Yes, acknowledge. Waiting for
Construction
affirmative.
complete.
Yes, acknowledge.
Building.
Yes, acknowledge.
Building.
Affirmative. Waiting order. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Yes, acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledge. 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 Yes, acknowledge.
Construction complete. Building.
Waiting order. Affirmative. Report. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Vehicle. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Vehicle. Yes. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Reporting. Affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledge. Yes. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes. Acknowledge.
Construction.
Vehicle reporting.
Building.
Yes. Yes. Acknowledge. Waiting orders. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Report. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Report. Acknowledge. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Insufficient funds. Construction
Vehicle reporting.
cannot deploy here.
Yes, affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Building.
Acknowledge. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes, affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Waiting. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Vehicle. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit lost.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Complete.
Acknowledge.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Yes. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
New construction options. Building.
Vehicle report. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Reporting. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes. Acknowledge. Vehicle. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Waiting order. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Yes, affirmative.
Building. Unit ready. Building. Building.
Vehicle report.
Construction
Yes, sir.
complete. Unit ready. Building.
Waiting. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Yes, acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledge.
Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Vehicle. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Yes, acknowledge. Vehicle reporting.
Construction complete. New construction options. Structure sold.
Yes, acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Waiting orders.
Acknowledge.
Unit
Acknowledge.
ready.
Reporting.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Reporting. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Waiting orders. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Waiting orders. Acknowledge.
Building. Building.
Reporting. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Yes. Acknowledge.
New construction options. Building.
Waiting. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction
orders.
complete.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Building. Unit ready.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Vehicle. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Waiting orders.
Vehicle reporting. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Vehicle. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Waiting. Acknowledge. Reporting.
Affirmative. Waiting.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Construction
Acknowledge.
complete. Primary building set. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Waiting orders.
Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledge.
Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Affirmative.
Waiting orders.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative.
Building. Building.
Acknowledge.
Building.
Waiting orders. Vehicle.
Affirmative.
Waiting orders.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Reporting. Yes.
Unit
Not a
lost.
problem. Not a problem. Reporting.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Vehicle.
Acknowledge.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Reporting. Acknowledge. Yes.
Affirmative.
Vehicle. Acknowledge. Yes. Affirmative.
Vehicle report. Affirmative.
Waiting order.
Reporting. Yes, sir. Waiting orders. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
New construction options. Building. Building.
Yes,
Vehicle
sir.
reporting.
Affirmative.
Reporting.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes, sir.
Construction complete. Unit lost. Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Primary building set.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit
Yes,
ready.
sir.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Waiting order. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Waiting order.
Vehicle report. Affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Select target. Select target.
Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative.
Yes, affirmative. Awaiting order. Affirmative.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Vehicle reporting.
Building.
Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready. Building.
Reporting.
Yes, affirmative.
Waiting order.
Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Awaiting
Yes,
order.
sir.
Vehicle
Affirmative.
reporting. Awaiting order.
Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Yes, acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Vehicle report. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Reporting. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir.
Vehicle
Yes, sir.
report. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledge.
lost.
Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Yes,
Acknowledged.
vehicle. Acknowledge. Yes, acknowledge. Waiting order. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Waiting order. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Base under attack.
Acknowledge.
Building. Unit ready.
Reporting. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledge. Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Wait. Acknowledge.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Building.
Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit
Yes, sir.
ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Wait.
Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, acknowledge. Affirmative.
Yes, acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Yes, yes, acknowledge.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Vehicle
Unit lost.
waiting.
Acknowledge.
Vehicle affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Acknowledge. Yes,
Vehicle acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
reporting.
Affirmative.
Yes,
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
yes,
Reporting. Waiting. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
acknowledge. Acknowledge. They have
Acknowledged.
reporting. Waiting order. Yes,
Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
report.
Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes,
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
waiting order.
Reporting. Yes.
Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting. Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting. Yes, vehicle
Affirmative.
reporting. Yes,
Reporting. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building. Building.
waiting order. Acknowledge. Yes, yes,
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
yes. Affirmative.
Unit ready. Building.
Reporting.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Unit
Yes, sir.
ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative.
Yes,
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Island cannon ready.
yes, yes, waiting. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Reporting.
Acknowledge. Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative.
Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, reporting.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Select target.
Yep,
Acknowledged.
reporting.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, 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 sir. Affirmative. Awaiting order.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Waiting. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative.
Awaiting order. Vehicle reporting. Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged.
Vehicle report. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Reporting. Acknowledge. Vehicle reporting. Acknowledge. Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Waiting order. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. 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 Reporting. Affirmative. Waiting order. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Reporting.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Vehicle report. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Waiting order.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Report. Acknowledge. Waiting order.
Acknowledged.
Yes, acknowledge. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Waiting order.
Yes,
Acknowledged.
yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Waiting order. Acknowledge. Yes, sir. Wait. Affirmative.
Yes. Affirmative.
Yes,
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
yes, affirmative. Acknowledge.
Mission accomplished.